All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us as we figure out some of these little technical kinks. We're here today to talk about Medicaid and to demystify some of the challenges and questions that we all have about navigating the system to receive necessary services for older adults. All right, we'll get started today with my introduction. My name is Tatiana Lloyd-Dotta. I'm one of the founding care managers here at Hera. I'm a geriatric social worker by training, and I have a subspecialty in hospice and end-of-life care. My passion in life is supporting older adults and their families as they navigate the challenges that come with aging and the healthcare system. I'm here with Abraham.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abraham. I'm the managing attorney at Abraham Mazloumi Associates. We focus mainly on estate planning and elder law, and we've been doing this for 15 years now. And today we're going to be covering some of the legal aspects involved in Medicaid and Medicaid planning. And thank you for having me here today.
Yes, thank you for joining us. All right, so quick overview of what we're going to cover today. First of all, the differences between Medicare and Medicaid. What do you already have provided by your insurance, and what can Medicaid offer if you were to enroll? Second, more specifics about what Medicaid offers and what it doesn't in various contexts. And of course, the burning question we all have, how do we qualify, and what's the process in applying? We ask that you put all questions in the chat, and we will respond to them in a follow-up email.
Oh, definitely. The more questions, the merrier. We'll get to all of them later.
All right, so the reality in New York State. Most often, people think that they're not eligible for Medicaid. However, this isn't the case in New York. Many families qualify even if they think their income or their asset levels are too high. The way to go about this is organizing and adjusting your assets in trust, working with an elder law attorney like Abraham. The key here that we want to really drive home is that you don't need to go forward with this, what is called a spend down, which basically means handing over whatever chunk of your income that's too high for Medicaid right over to the government versus holding on to those assets for yourself.
Exactly.
All right, so we understand that Medicaid and all the laws and the financial components can be very intangible for people. So we wanted to pull together this fictional character that's going to go alongside us on this journey of exploring Medicaid to help people anchor themselves in the reality of what all this means in a real life context. So we have Ruth and Harold. They're a couple that's been together for over 50 years. They own their home in Queens, and they have done pretty well in saving and preparing for their retirement. Unfortunately, Harold was recently diagnosed with Parkinson's, and Ruth is finding it challenging to manage all of his physical care needs independently. They've heard rumors about Medicaid, but they assume they didn't apply because they had a decent income, and therefore they didn't pursue looking into things further. But we're here today to explain to you that they do qualify for Medicaid, and we'll go over how this is going to benefit them in the long term in addressing Harold.
That's great because a lot of clients come to me and say, hey, we spend all our money for our parents on care because we thought they don't qualify for Medicaid.
Mhm.
So I'm glad that we can clarify this today.
Yeah. So first, let's get into the basics of what Medicare covers versus what Medicaid covers. So when I'm assessing a new family, usually one of the first questions I get is, well, what does my Medicare cover? I already have Medicare. I pay my premiums each month. What will that offer me? So Medicare is federal health insurance. The primary recipients are people who paid into the system and are over the age of 65. The basics of what it will offer you is coverage for hospital stays and doctor's visits, just like a normal health insurance. Through a prescription D plan, you can also get coverage for prescription medications, and you get support for short-term skilled nursing. So what this means is, let's say Harold were to have a hip surgery and need to go to a rehab for 60 days to get his strength back and work on his walking, that will be covered. But Medicare can be pretty limiting what's offered in the long term, and that's where Medicaid comes in. So Abraham, what can people expect when they apply for Medicaid?
Yeah, thank you for this background on Medicare. Medicare and Medicaid gets very confusing because they sound very similar. They share the same four first letters, but they're very, very different. Medicare, you qualify usually, you're 65, as you said, and doctor visits and that sort of stuff. Um, but what does Medicaid cover? Medicaid covers what basically Medicare doesn't cover, and in our context, and this is what we're focusing today, is long-term care. So let's say somebody who is, well enough to not be in a nursing home, but not well enough to be at home alone, or you need some care on a long-term basis. Medicare does not cover that. Only Medicaid will cover it. Same with the nursing home. Medicare, as you mentioned already, it would cover some short-term rehab. It does not cover for somebody who needs to be permanently residing in a nursing home. And this is where, for a lot of people, Medicaid becomes crucial.
Right. And in the context of Ruth and Harold, Harold's Medicare will cover the doctor visits and prescriptions related to his Parkinson's. However, as his condition continues to decline and his wife Ruth, who's also in her 80s, is not able to physically support him, the family is going to need to consider a way to cover the needed care to keep him at home and to keep him safe. All right, so to get a little bit deeper here, there are two main buckets that Medicaid falls into as far as the type of care they provide. So the first is called community Medicaid, and just as the name indicates, it covers services in the community. So what this means for Ruth and Harold is if, let's say Ruth just needs help getting Harold dressed and showered every day and get some meal preparation taken care of, Medicaid will send a caregiver to the home for, or usually around 5 hours a day to support physical and personal care needs. It'll also cover things such as day programs and some equipment that can be installed in the home. Now, let's say Harold's condition progresses to the point that Ruth is no longer able to keep him safe in their home. That would mean, as Abraham mentioned, that he would need to go to a nursing home for long-term care. So, in this case, you would switch the Medicaid over to what's called institutional Medicaid. So the Medicaid institution will pay for Harold's stay at the rehab. Out of pocket, this is over $800 a day. So as you can imagine, this would be a very, very large financial strain on Ruth and Harold's family if they were not able to coordinate Medicaid coverage.
I just wanted to quickly add to that sometimes Medicaid for somebody at home would cover even up to 24 hours a day. It's rare, and Medicaid is very strict now, but under the right circumstances, it is an option sometimes.
Yes. We'll go over how Hera can help you engage with that system later on in the presentation. All right, so when it comes to the financial component, that's what stresses families out the most in this process. So Abraham, can you tell us a little bit more about the hard line, what makes you eligible and what makes you ineligible for Medicaid assistance?
Okay, yes, and Medicaid gets complicated, so I'm going to try to keep it very broadly speaking here, the general guidelines, and these are for 2026 for this year, and I need to add, these numbers apply, generally speaking, in our case, for people who are either over 65 or disabled or blind. And the reason I'm saying it, there's some people that are on Medicaid under 65, but they have their own requirements. So today we're focusing only on those individuals. So if you're not married, you're single, you're entitled to 1836 in countable income, and you are entitled to approximately $33,000 of countable assets. And I say countable because Medicaid does not always count every source of income and every asset. So, for example, retirement incomes, retirement assets such as IRAs or 401ks usually are not counted as an asset, provided you take the required minimum distribution.
Right.
Now, you have a married couple and both of them apply, they have other guidelines. And this is where Medicaid gets a little funky because, for example, as a non-married person, I mentioned already, you can have approximately $33,000 in assets. You would think a married couple can have $66,000 in assets, but that's not the case. You can only have $44,796. Same with the income. in Medicaid land, 1 + 1 is not always 2. So for a married couple, you can only have 2,000, what is it, $489 this year in income, in countable income. And to make it even more complicated, there are cases, many cases, where you have a married couple, but only one needs Medicaid. So if that's the case, where only one spouse applies, but the other one does not apply, then the income levels are more favorable, in that the non-applying spouse is entitled to keep up to approximately this year $4,000 in income. And you can even get the income from the applying spouse. In other words, if the non-applying spouse's income is not $4,000, that spouse is entitled to keep some of that income from the applying spouse. And the assets jump from $44,000 to almost $160,000, $162,000. So what Medicaid really is saying here, listen, married couple, don't even think about applying both of you. Try to only one of you apply. And if that's the case, we go easy on you.
Right. So, as we can see, there's lots of complication when you incorporate married couples and income. So again, to anchor us in a real world example, we'll talk about Ruth and Harold. So between the two of them, they make over $6,000 a month in income, and they have over $1,800 in the bank in savings. On paper, it seems like they're over the limits. However, with proper planning with an attorney like Abraham, we can fix that and apply Harold for Medicaid.
Okay, so waiting for the slide. Okay, perfect. So one of the big Medicaid strategies that people can employ is what's called spousal refusal. Meaning, there's a married couple, and let's say the husband, in our example now, Harold, needs to apply for Medicaid, and imagine a scenario where Ruth, for whatever reason, does not want to make her income or her assets part of the Medicaid mix, or quite frankly, her income is a little bit too high or her assets are too high, and they would not otherwise qualify. Harold wouldn't qualify. So one strategy would be to do what's called a spousal refusal. So what Ruth would be saying essentially is, listen, I love Harold, but not enough to make my income and my assets available. And if we do a spousal refusal, Medicaid would be required to essentially pretend that Ruth has no income and Ruth has no assets. And at that point, Medicaid would look only at Harold's income and assets. And if those assets and that income is under the limits, he would then qualify. Problem is, I mean, it's not a problem, just be aware of it. In Medicaid land, there's no such thing as free lunch. So Medicaid reserves the right later on to go after Ruth and say, hey, Ruth, we paid all this money on behalf of Harold, but we expect you to pay some of your income and some of your assets towards his care. Usually, first of all, that doesn't always happen. And even if it doesn't happen, Medicaid can only recover from Ruth what they paid on behalf of Harold, not more than that. And in any event, that's usually at the Medicaid rate level, which is much cheaper than if Harold had to pay privately. So usually a spousal refusal is definitely a strategy that we will look at for our clients.
Yeah. Considering the high cost of living that we all feel here in New York, it's important to save money wherever we can, particularly when supporting older adults. All right. So what if you're over the limit, like Harold and Ruth are?
Yes. So quite frankly, I think in New York most people are, or a lot of them are. So there's a lot of strategies and options we can employ, but big picture, it usually comes down to one or all of three options, which is to transfer your assets, be it to your spouse maybe, or to a child, and it depends on if you're doing community Medicaid or institutional Medicaid, because there's a look back. But Bottom line is gifting some of the assets outright. Then the other option would be to transfer your assets to a trust, and we're going to cover that soon. The revocable trust, irrevocable trusts. So that's for the assets. And if a person or that person's spouse have too much income, what we often do is to set up what's called a pooled income trust to shield that person's or that couple's income from Medicaid.
And that means they can use all of those funds to pay their bills,
Correct.
mortgage, and things they need for their own care. So, what about transferring assets? In the context of Ruth and Harold, they have savings, they could transfer over to their daughter. They also own their apartment in Queens. How does that apply here in making sure that Harold becomes eligible?
Yeah, so very, very good question, because this is a very important part of Medicaid planning to know that we need to distinguish between community Medicaid, which is for people who need care in the community, and a nursing home Medicaid. And the reason for that is, as a lot of people know, nursing home Medicaid, there's a 5-year look back. Meaning when you apply for nursing home Medicaid looks back and tries to determine what have you done in the last 5 years. Did you transfer any assets? Did you make any gifts? And that's when Medicaid says, aha. Whereas for community Medicaid in New York, and New York is probably the last state standing, or one of the last states where there's no look back for community Medicaid. That's right, no look back for community Medicaid, which means Harold could theoretically transfer his assets today and apply for Medicaid tomorrow. I'm exaggerating a little bit now, but to make a point, there's no look back for New York for community Medicaid. What's also important to know is not every transfer triggers what's called a transfer penalty. There's exceptions. So, for example, if Harold were to transfer some of his assets to Ruth, Medicaid would be okay with that. Of course, then Ruth will have too many assets maybe, and may need to do her own planning. But at the application stage, that would help a married couple. Or you may have, God forbid, a disabled child. There's a few exceptions, but generally speaking, transferring assets is very easy in community Medicaid situations. With nursing home applications, it's much trickier. And because of that, we always say, if you need to do transfers, if Medicaid is on the horizon, do it as fast as you can to get over the 5 years.
Right. So preparation and talking to experts is always going to be the path forward to make sure that you're protected and you receive the care needed. All right, so you keep mentioning assets and trust. So Abraham, how do we pull it all together and ensure that a family is, let's say in the context of Ruth and Harold, their Queens home is protected while still receiving that crucial Medicaid physical support?
Okay, so that's an excellent question, especially because a lot of our clients, a lot of New Yorkers, they own a home, and it's not only a house, it's a house, it could be a condo, it could be a co-op apartment. That's all considered like real estate and Medicaid land. And one way to protect it is to put it into a trust, because that has, I mean, of course, you can just gift your assets to your children, let's say, but that has usually gift or estate tax ramifications. So, or capital gains tax ramifications. So very often it's just better for many reasons to put it into a trust. So a trust is a legal entity. Think of it like maybe like a corporation or like another entity where you put your stuff in it, and then you get to dictate who gets your asset when you die. So in many ways, it's a little bit like a will, except you're relinquishing ownership already today, especially if it's an irrevocable trust. And if you put your assets into, let's say, in an irrevocable trust, let's say the Queen's house, then it's no longer Ruth and Harold's house.
So currently it's in a revocable trust. Is that the same or just as helpful as irrevocable?
Okay, so excellent question. A revocable trust, because you can revoke it, the assets would still be deemed as if it's their assets. So especially for nursing home Medicaid, it would be not very helpful to have your assets in a revocable trust because Medicaid would still count it as your assets. So we generally prefer, if possible, to do an irrevocable trust and over a revocable trust. A revocable trust may help, especially for a personal residence, because you can be on Medicaid and still keep your home, but because Medicaid can later on recover from your estate, if you have it in a revocable trust and then you die, it's not part of your estate and therefore protected for Medicaid. But I quickly want to go back a little bit to how a trust would work. In a trust, you get to say who gets your assets when you die. And every trust has a manager, so you can make your children or a cousin or friend, whoever you trust, to essentially manage these assets in a trust. And a very big important factor is even though you have to give your assets into a trust, if it's an irrevocable trust, even though you don't own the assets any longer and you don't have any rights to them, you can, if you want, be entitled to the income. Very, very important for families to know. So you can give your assets. Let's say you have a rental property, you can put the real estate into a trust. You don't own it any longer for Medicaid purposes, but you're entitled to the rental income if that's what you want.
Key.
Let me just say one more thing to the trust, please, because it's important. Even you transfer assets to a trust, always be worried about the 5-year look back. So a transfer to a trust is like any other transfer. So therefore, always we tell our clients, the earlier you transfer your assets, if that's what you want, the better, because you never know when you may need Medicaid one day.
So Ruth and Harold is a fresh diagnosis for Harold with Parkinson's, but as we know, it is a degenerative disease, right? So would behoove Ruth to start this process earlier on to protect their home in the long run, as we know Harold's going to need care in the future.
And also, who knows, maybe one day Ruth needs her own care.
All right. And back to the Queen's home that Ruth and Harold own. How do we help them hold on to that asset, remain in their home, and receive the care they need?
Yeah, I think it's very good that we're focusing today again on some of these residents, because there's a lot of I don't want to say rumors, but misinformation out there about one's home. So Medicaid does not count your home, assuming the equity is up to, I think this year it's what is it, 1.13 million. Does not cover that does not count as an asset, meaning you can apply for Medicaid even though you have $1 million home. The problem with that is that Medicaid still one day can, especially if there's no exception, there's no surviving spouse, there's no disabled child involved, there's no sibling that has some sort of equity interest in the house. If none of those exceptions apply, when you die, Medicaid can later on put a lien on the house or recover from the estate, even though you were allowed to have Medicaid and even though you were allowed to have your home. So we always say, even if it's your home, even though it's your studio condo that may be worth less than $1 million, it's usually, not always, but usually not a good idea just to ignore it. Yeah. And then one other thing is, again, there's capital gains tax implications by transferring assets. So we've seen it many, many times where people who didn't know better, they just transferred their home to their child to qualify for Medicaid. And they say, hey, listen, I don't have an asset anymore, my children own it. And I say, yes, but you just open up the Pandora's box for capital gains taxes. Because if you just transfer something to somebody, that person later on may be liable for capital gains taxes. So that's another reason why usually transfer real estate to an irrevocable trust that's designed for purposes of Medicaid is a better option. Or maybe do a life estate deed. Anything other than just outright transfers usually are the better way to go.
In the case of Ruth and Harold, they want their home to go to their daughter one day, so it's important to protect on the front end. That way they can ensure that asset will remain in the family. All right. So back to that point about estate recovery and liens, what are things to look out for families as they're going through the process of considering Medicaid?
Okay, so the tricky thing is, and I always tell people who ask, look at Medicaid a little bit like it's a credit card, right? So the credit card, you know, you go to a store, you buy stuff, and you're like, oh, I just, you know, I didn't have to pay right now. But obviously, we all know the bill will come later, right? It's going to come in the mail. So Medicaid is a little bit like this, that keep track of whatever they're spending on your behalf. And Medicaid reserves the right to later on when the person dies to send the bill, and we've seen those bills, and say, hey, to the estate or to the surviving children, let's say, look, we paid all this money, please pay us back. So it's important to avoid having too many assets in your estate. So one key issue to look at is you may have an IRA, you may have bank accounts where you have that you didn't plan for, and what happens is those assets are in your estate. So Medicaid can later on attach to that estate by way of a lien or what's called estate recovery. So one thing we usually tell clients, if you can, it may be better for you to have beneficiary designations. Let's say you have an IRA, a bank account, or an annuity, have a beneficiary designation, because this way it'll pass directly to that person rather than through the estate. And one question I always get asked, or not always, but often, hey, Abraham, I have a will. Isn't that good enough for my assets? And I say, no, 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 no. A will governs only when you're dead. Until then, the assets are yours. So therefore, even if you mentioned your assets in your will, for Medicaid asset protection purposes, it does absolutely nothing. So in fact, your goal of Medicaid planning is so you are left with stuff to give when you die.
So now we're talking a lot about retirement accounts, savings accounts, homes, assets of this nature. But what about that $6,400 that Ruth and Harold get each month from Social Security and their pension? How do they protect that money so they don't have to hand it over in this process?
Right. So what we are talking about right now is essentially called excess income, right? So what do you do when a Medicaid applicant has too much income, whether based on his own income or based on the income of the married couple combined? So what Medicaid wants you to do is just to hand over the excess income to Medicaid, essentially like a deductible, and Medicaid would give you Medicaid. Of course, that would be crazy.
Right. That's known as the spend down, which is what we want to try to help you avoid so you can pay your necessary monthly bills.
Exactly. Spend down, excess income. There's a lot of terms for that. And what we would do, so in our example here, we have somebody whose income is 2,036 per month, and the Medicaid limit for a single person is 1,836. So in our example, this person has $200 in, as you call it, a spend down amount or an excess income. So Medicaid says, give us the $200 and we give you Medicaid. But that's a lot of money, $200, just to let it go.
That could be groceries right there.
Correct, exactly. And other people have spend on or excess income of $1,000 or $2,000, right? So we would set up a pooled income trust, or we would assist the client to set up a pooled income trust. And now let's say Harold. Let's say Harold were not married in this example. Harold would transfer his $200 to the pooled income trust. And if Harold is determined to be disabled, which we already know he is, and we can help with making that, formalizing that, it's called a disability determination. But let's assume he is, then the $200 that he puts to the pool trust every month, Medicaid would be required to disregard it. So in other words, on paper, Medicaid would Harold as if his income is only 1,836. So what happens to the $200? Doesn't disappear. Otherwise, what's the point of doing it? So Harold gets to use that money to pay for his bills, for his phone bill, for his food, for his electric bill, whatever. I mean, here's $200, so he would be maybe using it for his cable bill. But imagine somebody's excess income is $1,000 or $2,000 or $3,000. They can pay it for rent, for property taxes, for essentially most of what is in your name can be paid by the pool trust. And it's a beautiful thing for New Yorkers.
Yes. All right. So let's say we've come to you with Harold and Ruth. They've done all the organization to protect their home and their assets, and they've set up a pooled income trust. Abraham, what's next as far as actually getting the plane off the ground to get the Medicaid application submitted and get them ready to start applying for that needed home care?
Okay, so the way we usually handle it, we sit down with the client and we go over kind of like take an inventory. What is that person's income? What are that person's assets? What needs to happen? Some people are already below the limits in terms of income and assets. Some people have only too much income, or some people have only too many assets, or some people have both. So there are combinations. Once we determine what the story is with a financial picture, we then come up with solutions. Sometimes an easy transfer of the assets, especially if it doesn't involve a lot of money. That may be the solution. In other cases, we may recommend a trust, and in another situation, we may recommend both. So we set that up, and then we assist the client with the transfers. And if the person needs Medicaid right away, we also, at the same time, while we're setting up all these strategies, we also work on the Medicaid application. So we can do it simultaneously. And then we help the client gather the documents, and especially when it's an institutional application, because they're the 5-year look back. Boy, Medicaid wants 5 years of your IRA statements, 5 years of a bank statement. So it gets tricky. 4 years of tax returns. So we help with that. We analyze it, see what the story is. And then, but ultimately, we then submit the application. And Medicaid now is taking its sweet time. So we say, I mean, at least 45 to 90 days, sometimes less, sometimes more, but just to be safe. And then we see it through. And then if Medicaid gets approved, great. If for whatever reason there's some issues, we are there to help see things through and liaise with Medicaid to see until the client is approved.
So helpful in many, many contexts.
I should probably add, and you've been also involved with that before. There is such a thing as emergency Medicaid or immediate needs Medicaid. So for some cases where your clients or our clients need Medicaid really like right away, they cannot wait 90 days, they cannot wait 45 days. There are ways around it. Just be aware of it.
Yes. All right. So now that we've gone into more detail about Medicaid, how to apply, what it offers, and the legal and financial components, let's talk about how this fits into the larger picture of geriatric care. So Hera, how we can support you is kind of navigating all the pieces of the puzzle to ensure that seniors stay safe and remain in their community, in their home. So we can help with a host of things, but it generally falls into 4 buckets of how we can support you. So first, this is coordinated referrals, right? If you need support scheduling doctor's appointments, transportation to those doctor's appointments, scheduling in-home providers, navigating various hospitalizations, we can support you every step of the way in navigating those resources and making sure all the pieces of the puzzle are in place. Second piece is medication oversight. So for seniors, this is one of the leading causes of hospitalizations and in some cases even death. So as a trained social worker, we can come in, help coordinate and identify medication management strategies that will ensure safety of adults where there's complicated medication use. Now see, the third bucket, and often where people need the most support, is benefits navigation. What does my Medicare cover? What won't it cover? How do I get cash assistance for my rent? How do I get, food stamp applications in order? How do I maintain my food stamps once they're off the ground? We can help you understand what you're eligible for, help you through the application process, and even with recertification process down the road. And last but not least, as we've gone into quite a bit today, is Medicaid and advocacy. So oftentimes we work with Hera or with Abraham and other attorneys to support identifying whether Medicaid is an option, supporting with the application process, and navigating the communication between all the professionals involved. And then, once you apply for Medicaid and get approved, we can also help you with the initiation of the home care component. There's a host of assessments that need to be done, paperwork that needs to be submitted. And then, once you get the home care agency in place, how do you navigate scheduling and specific training necessary? We can support you with that every step of the way.
Yeah, you raise an excellent point because getting Medicaid is oftentimes half the battle, especially when it comes to home care. It's very, very tricky to navigate the system. So it's amazing that Hera can come in and then take it to the finish line, essentially. Because a lot of families, they're overwhelmed. Who do you call? Who do you not call? What agency do you need to call? So there's a lot of support that's really necessary and oftentimes crucial for somebody who already has Medicaid. Now what? And this is where I think somebody like you is so, so valuable. So let me just briefly explain what we do in the process also. So when people come to us, obviously we talk to them about Medicaid if that's what they need, but we also take a general inventory. Are there any other planning needs? Does Harold have an old will that's antique by now that may need to be updated because it doesn't reflect his wishes anymore? Does Ruth have a power of attorney? Because if God forbid she became incapacitated and she didn't have a power of attorney, how would Harold make decisions for her? Because even married couples, if you don't have a power of attorney, it gets very, very tricky. Which leads me to the other component that we try to help clients avoid, but we can help, are guardianships. So because guardianships are necessary if there is no power of attorney. So that's why even when people come to us for Medicaid, we try to kind of look at the big picture and see if there's any planning needs that need to be addressed right now. So this is what we do.
Yes. Trying to avoid heartbreak down the road.
Correct.
Indeed. All right. So, with all those pieces floating around, let's just bring it back to Ruth and Harold and what they decided to do and how we were able to get Ruth and Harold some Medicaid support in their home. So first, they set up that pooled income trust with Abraham's team to make sure that they can hold on to that extra $200 a month and use it towards their monthly bills. They were able to put their excess assets and their home into an irrevocable trust that Abraham's team would set up with them to ensure that all of that is protected so they can remain in their home for the rest of their life. And so their daughter would be able to hold on to that asset and keep it in the family for generations to come. And Ruth was able to go forward with the spousal refusal to protect her income to ensure they could still meet their monthly financial needs. So in the end, even though it seemed like there was no way they could apply, going through the process and engaging the proper professionals like Abraham and myself allows couples like Ruth and Harold to remain in the community, well supported, without draining all of their financial resources. All right, so if any of this sounds applicable to you or someone that you might work with or know, we would love to hear from you to figure out how Abraham and I can support you further. You can reach out to us at these phone numbers and emails or contact our offices to discuss working with us and further supports.
This is great. And I want to add that I'm seeing a lot of amazing questions coming in.
Yes.
Keep them coming, and we try to get to all of them.
And if there's anything else you would like another seminar about that we could discuss, please let us know, and we'd be happy to dive deeper into any of these topics.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.